of my opening statement is going to be set to a response to whatever his criticisms are, and then we'll move into the back and forth debate. Remember, for those of you just joining, we'll be taking on callers tonight. We expect a full house. Make sure you get in the call queue early if you want to call in on this debate. We'll be reading all super chats as well. And with that, let's get to it.
All right.
I'll set your timer for 7 minutes, Jacob. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Cool. All right, so I have two main criticisms I want to level towards Andrew. First is related to marriage. So first I want to define marriage. In Genesis, we are told, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Also, we are told they are told to be fruitful and multiply. And these commands are given universally and never later changed to only be applied to Christians. So God's natural order is for men and women to join together and have families. Now, is there a distinction between being married outside the body of Christ? For sure, being brought into communion with Christ impacts all areas of our life, including marriage. Churches have authority to oversee and enforce biblical standards and to use discipline on the members of their church. This doesn't nullify secular marriages, but it's an enhancement and bolster on the part of Christian marriages. Now, I agree with Andrew that it is in our best interest to divorce marriage from the state. We have different reasons for that. Where I disagree fundamentally with Andrew, though, is in his characterization of secular unions that are adhering to the proper structure of one man and one woman as being degenerate and therefore not things that Christians should promote. Andrew used the term degeneracy light in his debate with Lauren Chen to describe her case that we as Christians should still encourage secular people to enter into monogamous heterosexual unions, marriages, based on evaluating the different outcomes, even if Andrew is right that secular marriages aren't, quote, real marriages. I would hesitate to call this consequentialism as Lauren did. Consequentialism is a theory of normative ethics that states that the moral value of an action should be judged based on its consequences. Well, we agree from the Christian worldview that that's wrong, and we instead dictate that what is moral is grounded in the essence of God and his revealed moral decrees given through the word and the church. An action is judged as good based on obedience to God, using reason to apply what God has prescribed. So the question we have to ask as Christians is, what has God prescribed, instructed us to do regarding marriage and relationships between non-believers? The underlying question being, what is prescribed for non-Christians? As Andrew and I would agree on the prescription for Christians, and the ultimate prescription is for the unsaved to become saved and then submit to Christ and the teachings of Christ through the church. But then, is there nothing prescribed to those who have not yet been saved? Nothing prescribed to those who are on the path but not there yet? And nothing prescribed to Christians to facilitate the drawing of more into the kingdom and the rule of Christ on earth? No, I would say we are prescribed by Scripture and by the church fathers and traditions to offer solutions, use influence, and lead society in the ways of Christ, even when they have not yet been born again into God's kingdom. The cultural mandate of Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over every living thing that moves on the earth. This means at minimum, we should instruct all to live according to Christian norms and ethics, which are creational norms and ethics. Some would call this natural law, that's objectively built into creation itself, even if they aren't yet Christian. The choice here is whether we encourage people to follow the natural order or not follow it. If we encourage them to follow it, even if they do so imperfectly, then the response is to continue to promote them to move closer to the natural order and to come to Christ ultimately, who will sanctify them and their relationships. And church fathers and theologians, there's many I could quote from. I'm going to start with two just for the opening statement to support this as well. Justin Martyr said, endeavor to persuade those who hate us unjustly to live conformably to the good precepts of Christ, to the end that they may become partakers with us of the same joyful hope of a reward from God, the ruler of all. And then St. John of Kronstadt, who's a Russian Eastern Orthodox archpriest from the 18th century, said, by loving our neighbor, we imitate God, we show ourselves to be children of God, and thus we are able to influence others positively. Part of loving our neighbor is drawing them into the ethos of Christianity, including seeking the goods of the Christian worldview, which can be used by God to draw individuals and promote virtue in society through the church. We can dive more into this when we get to the back and forth, but let me quickly level my second criticism. I agree with a lot of Andrew's descriptions and even some of his prescriptions when it comes to politics, but where the disagreement comes fundamentally is in the defining of the morally normative use of force by the standards of Christian ethics. Authority isn't inherently bad, And the Bible does prescribe different types of authority. All authority, including civil, comes from God, but that authority is given only to do what is specifically prescribed. And any deviation from that would be a misuse of the authority God has granted. The civil magistrate is prescribed to wield the sword against those who do evil in the civil context, meaning the enforcement of property rights and the obligation against initiating violence. This is understood because of the principle of lex talionis, or just retribution, established in Genesis 9, which was also clearly present as part of the Mosaic civil law, though it operates differently in the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant also included other laws and norms, ceremonial laws and such, and specific commands, which ended when that covenant ended, being fulfilled and superseded by the new covenant in Christ, the true offspring of Abraham. Outside of the temporary Mosaic covenant, civil governance is only prescribed to enforce civil justice. This is a crucial component of my argument that libertarianism is the consistent conclusion of Christian ethics. It's not a rejection of authority, it's a rejection of unjust authority. 1 Samuel 8 depicts God's warning to Israel that the king will rob from them and from God, make them his slaves. In order for government to be Christian, it must not violate God's moral decrees, as government is just individual people with authority. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder. These don't have exceptions. You can justify or use force to, you can justify the use of force to uphold property rights and to respond to violence. You cannot justly initiate or use force to regulate or prevent all sinful behavior, and those who try end up straying from Christian ethics. If they aren't banning all sinful behavior, then they have no consistent standard for which nonviolent sins should be legal and which shouldn't be. Theonomists and the like will try to appeal to the Mosaic Civil Code, but that was for a specific people, specific time, and that covenant's purpose was to bring about the Christ. We see in ancient Israel's case, and in all of human history, that attempting to use force to deal with the problem of sin does not work and does not work to create a godly society. And those are the two fundamental disagreements that I have.
All right. If that finishes up for you, we'll set the 7 minutes for Andrew. You can get started whenever you're ready.
Sure. So I'm going to be a little bit more brief, as I think I can kind of get at most of these criticisms quickly. As, again, my opening statement is going to be used to defend against the criticisms rather than my positions in general, so I did not know which ones he was going to attack. So we'll start with marriage. We're told the definition in Genesis. I agree. However, I would say that these have been even further clarified by church teachings, also by the New Testament. Nullification of secular marriage, promotion of such is degenerate. And I'm going to triple down on this, and let me explain why. First of all, degeneracy means without morals. He's already created another category. He says there's a category of marriage, that's Christian marriage, and there's another category which is not Christian marriage. Is that category less moral? He's going to have a struggle answering this question. They all have a struggle answering this question. Is this other category less moral? In order for us to say that we recognize this as being equal, he's going to have to say that they're equal in morality. He's not going to be able to do that. So it's actually not possible for him to do. He's going to say this other category is not the fullness of marriage. He'll use every word he can possibly make, except to say that it's less moral. But it has to be. Otherwise, why would it be in another category? It makes no sense. But capitalizing on that, just so you understand, in the context of that debate, we're talking about secular marriage in the United States. And this is state marriage, which is a promotion of what I consider to be inversion. State marriage is an actual inversion of Christian marriage. And let me explain how. First of all, you take the head of the church out and you instead make the head the state. That's problem number one. Secondly, you give the wife egalitarianism and incentives to destroy the marriage from the state, who is the head, and promoting egalitarianism inside of marriage itself is an inversion of the man being the head, the representation of the head of the church, and the woman, the body, who the man is the head of. Because it's an inversion, the sign of the satanic, the sign of anything which is satanic, is always what is inverted. That's how you can generally tell. Tons of church teachings on this as well for how you can spot inversion. I don't even think my opponent would disagree that this is true. For those who are prescribed marriage in a non-Christian union, I would say that this is an overarching bad. And so does my opponent. So I don't know what he's going to end up fighting me about. Natural law, also, he references that. Totally made up. It's a made up category. That's not a thing he can demonstrate. I'm happy to get into that with him as well. Secular marriage, moving on to the second criticism for the purpose of time constraints. He says politically defining the use of force in Christian ethics is bad. No, it's not bad. That's actually a silly argument. Doesn't make any sense. And here's how I can demonstrate how much of his actual position here with this libertarianism is nonsense. Because as he says that he can prescribe this law, and that there's going to be some civil enforcement of law, we're going to end up in something which is arbitrary. And here's an example. He says that we must utilize enforcement of property rights. That's what he claims is kind of the overarching worldview, at least from his perspective. The core of his perspective is property rights enforcement. But what gives somebody the right to own property? What actually gives somebody the right to own land? How do we know that they own the land? What gives them right to it? I would love to know the answer to that question, and we're going to dive into that as well. Of course, you can use force to regulate behavior. We've been doing it since the dawn of time. We're going to continue to do it. I really don't see how he's going to argue against that either. He says that attempting to use force to enforce morality or Christian ethics doesn't work. Of course, it works. We've seen that 100 times as well. So with that, I'm happy to yield the rest of my time and dive right into this debate.
All right. With both of the opening statements done, we are going to go ahead and move into the back and forth. I'm going to set my timer for that, and you guys just go ahead and get after it whenever you're ready.
So, Jacob, let me ask you a question. Let us assume for a moment that you crash on an island in the middle of the uncharted sea, and it's a large island, and it's you and your wife. Very large island, in fact. Let's say it's multiple miles across, but no country holds claim to this island. No country does. And you land there on this island with your wife, and you start to have children, and you begin to populate this island. Would you say that the island is then your property?
I would hold to the idea that to justly own property means that you have to homestead it. And so to homestead property means that you have to have made some kind of, visible change to the land, mixed your labor with it in some sense, although that's a clumsy analogy. There's also the idea that in a legal theory that it's whoever has the whoever has the best claim to it. So, if you're the only person on the island.
What does that mean, Jacob? What does it mean?
What does what
you
mean?
You say they can homestead it, therefore that makes it theirs. Why? Why does that instantly make it theirs? Because they can homestead it or they have done some improvement to it. Why?
Well, we know that property can be owned based on biblical principles. The Bible upholds property rights, even just from the commandment, do not steal. You can't have theft without property. So then we're talking
I need to define how we're going to be able to ascertain who owns the property.
Right. So it comes down, so people will recognize claims of other people's property generally, and then if there's a dispute over that property, then you do need something like civil magistrates or third-party arbitration.
Force.
If it comes down to it, yeah.
That's all force.
Yeah, I don't think.
So
I think
all you're doing is making the argument that property rights are force. The second property is disputed, what happens, Jacob?
Yeah, I don't think that my position is that we can't use. I think my opening statement, I said we can use force to uphold property rights.
Well, no, there's no can use, right? If there's any dispute over property,
we're morally obligated to use force to protect property rights.
Are we though? Because when you're inside of a dispute like this, right, it really does just come down to whoever has the most force owns the property, actually, right?
Well, no, now you're getting down into descriptive versus prescriptive. Yes, it is true in a descriptive sense that might makes right to some degree in the world that we live in. But in terms of from the Christian worldview of what is prescribed in terms of God's moral decrees, we could say, well, if a big country invades a small one and takes all their land and stuff like that happens all the time.
Right. So let's start with this then, so that we don't go too far into the weeds. We'll just kind of narrow and hone down in on this. So starting with property rights itself, you say descriptively you agree with me that it is force, descriptively. But that does not mean that we ought to use force. It just means that descriptively it does come down to force, right?
Yeah, I mean, going off biblical principles, we're told to try to live at peace with others as far as it depends on us. So we should, relegate as Christians force to being like the last option that we would use to protect our property. But yeah, there's ultimately many situations where to uphold that property right is going to require force.
Well, then let me ask you how you would resolve this matter as a Christian. A person has cross-generational family land, and they have water which goes through that land. That water which goes through the land is used as a trade hub on a later built town on the coast, which people depend upon. He blocks that off because it's technically on his land, right? Who here should eminent domain take effect and his land be seized, or should he have the right to block it off at the expense of everybody else in the town down from the river?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of libertarians have come up with different answers for this. Some people try to say that there should be some kind of easement for things like that. Other people say that water or like natural resources like that shouldn't be, things that people should be morally encouraged to to own or use stuff like that. It's important to note that while this is a real issue that there's not a perfect solution from a libertarian worldview, I don't think that there's a perfect solution from the from a state worldview either, because corporations can still do this and do environmental damage all the time, and they just pay off politicians and law enforcement and pass regulations to get away with their various.
There is a perfect solution from a corporate perspective or a state perspective. They go in with guns and they unblock it. They arrest him and they throw him in prison, and that's the end of it. It's a perfect solution.
Yeah. Well, I think what libertarians would say is that rather than, relying on force, which there are some libertarians who say that there can be force used in that sort of instance, but that rather what they would try to encourage in a more libertarian legal order society would be contract law and things like that, which you'd have market forces incentivizing against people doing that. So you would set up a system that tries
but
to
he just really doesn't
minimize.
want to, Jacob. He just really doesn't. He doesn't want to play ball, Jacob. He doesn't want to, and it's his shit. He has the cross-generational claim, as you just said. He's been homesteading the land. It's his, Jacob. It's his land. He can just do that, can't he?
If there's water running through his land and he's really like homesteaded everything around the land, you could construct a scenario where there was no contract. I mean, listen, prevention's always better than cure. And I think that a libertarian free market society does better in preventing these problems than the state does. And again, you can say there's a perfect solution of we take men with guns and go in there, but
that's the price. Well, wait, that solution works every single time, doesn't it?
Except that it doesn't get in practice. Again, if you're saying
in practice, it seems to work better than anything that you've proposed. In practice, in fact, every single situation that I look at,
states and governments are like the biggest polluters in the world.
Yeah, maybe so. But when it comes down to enforcement of whatever policy is, they seem to be able to enforce it fine. So you can argue that they make some stupid policies. Sure, everybody makes stupid policies. Libertarian governments would make stupid policies and have made stupid policies.
I'm not prescribing.
But ultimately, what I'm saying to you is that, yes, the state is quite effective at just going in with guns and saying, no, unblock this waterway. And the residents down there are now going to get the goods and services that they need on this waterway. They seize it via eminent domain. And Jacob, that seems like it's optimal to me. That seems like a way more optimal system than, we'll come up with a bunch of bizarre, nuanced contract nonsense. You can't actually make
expedient.
Yeah, but Jacob,
I don't think it's necessarily.
I need to hear the argument for why it's more immoral.
Well, I think that you have to have a larger view, a lower time preference of evaluating these situations. Because when we create centralized institutions of power, there might be immediate payoffs and things that you would count on the good side of the ledger, but over a long period of time, what are the trade-offs, right? I mean, I kind of take that Thomas Sowell approach to politics, and I'm not a libertarian absolutist, although I like the video you were listening to of me from a couple years ago today when your debate prep. Back then, I was probably more of a in like my libertarian cage stage. Like I was full like, Rothbard this and Hayek that and all that. And I try to take more of a pragmatic view at this point in my political theory. I think, listen, I think both agree that neither of our views are going to create a utopia that prevent some sort of problems. But if I think
not trying to say that mine does, I'm trying to say that my view though is superior.
Well, and I would
I'm
disagree.
going to
I think
I know that's what we're arguing about.
If we're talking about trade-offs, which I like the Thomas Sowell quote that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. I think the trade-offs of a libertarian legal order are far preferable to the trade-offs of a
that's nice, but I need to hear a moral argument for why it is that the government shouldn't just come in, shouldn't just unblock it, shouldn't just let the water flow.
All right, I'll give you an answer. If we create a monopoly of force so powerful that it can make decisions like that against people's property, then the trade-offs of that are what we see around us. We see that free markets are completely destroyed and subverted. We've created an institution.
Well, now you're reversing descriptive and prescriptive again. You're saying because it is this way, then that prescriptively means that it shouldn't be that way. That makes no sense. You're saying that if we create a monopoly on force with some type of entity, that means they have to then use it to be oppressive? It doesn't seem that way to me. It seems like you could have an absolute force monopoly that only did good things, right?
I mean, in sure, theoretically.
Sure. So the thing is that if we could,
I could also say in my theoretical libertopia that everyone just contractually agrees to not. So, I mean, like we can both say, well, this doesn't have to go bad, but we could just look empirically and say most of the time when we centralize power, this is what happens.
No, it doesn't seem to go bad when you centralize power. In fact, it seems to go bad when you polarize populations rather than having something which is a central theme inside the population. In fact, I would say that if your population has a single religion that is monopolistic, that your society's better. I would say that if your society is homogenous and monopolistic that way, that it's better. I would say that diversity is not a strength. I would say that having these kind of core buildup of powers is a good thing, Jacob.
Yeah, again, I think empirically, let's look at here at America, right? We started out as a constitutional republic. We were very small, very decentralized in terms of the government. As that has grown, things that you and I care about, right? Like having, I think you and I would be fellow travelers when it comes to wanting to see an increase of Christianity in our society. We see that as
you wouldn't want some monopoly like that. They'd have the monopoly on force, Jacob.
Well, I'm talking culturally, spiritually. And,
but they would then Christians would have a monopoly on force. You don't want that.
They didn't have, Christians didn't have a monopoly on force.
Oh, really?
You're talking about in the I mean. Yes.
Are you sure, Jacob?
It was a majority. All right, let me imagine.
Yeah.
It was a majority of Christians when America was founded. So yes, the institution of force that did exist was controlled by Christians.
That's right.
But they didn't have this giant centralized power, right?
Yes, they did.
I'm not using.
Hey, wait. What do you mean they didn't? The president of who's the commander in chief of the United States Armed Forces from the inception of our nation, Jacob?
Right, it was the president.
It's the president of the United States. He is in full command of the entire armed forces of America, who are all Christians, a centralized authority over all of the force. Hang on, Jacob, wait. Over all of the force of the United States, one guy held the keys. One.
Right. And the anti-federalists were right. We should have never signed the Constitution, but that's a whole other different rabbit hole. Compared to what, right? So yes, in the abstract, that's still more government than I want. But compared to a lot of the governments that existed around that time, compared to the government we have today, it was much smaller, much more decentralized.
Yeah, that's because there wasn't as many people. First of all, there wasn't as many people. We were living in basically coastal areas because people settle where there's water. Okay, that's why. There wasn't very many people. Most of this landmass had not been conquered at that point. That's why you had a smaller government. But as far as representation goes, right? No, there was really quite a bit of bureaucracy, which was going on during not only the founding of the nation, but during the 13 colonies. There was bureaucracy all over the place. The government was absolutely stuffed to the brim with bureaucrats, in fact. And you had state religions on top of that. Every single colony had a state religion. And then post-constitutional ratification, they still had state religions. It was bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy. I don't know how you can say that this was some libertarian. It wasn't. In fact, one of the first things they did was the Whiskey Rebellion, right? Very first thing they did was they went ahead and they grabbed the militia and used force in order to make sure that people were paying their taxes like they were supposed to. Very first thing they did. We've always had a monopoly on force in the United States. Arguably, it's always worked extremely well as long as you have moral people who are in the positions of power.
Sure, if you have moral people, that helps, but how long does that last? And I would say that the American experiment, where it went wrong, was it centralized power too much. Now, a Christian majority was able to keep that power relatively in check for a time, but I would say, and this was part of what I got into in my response video to you, was that I think the problem is that when you centralize power too much, what inevitably happens is that the incentive structure of that centralized power is going to work against Christianity. It's actually going to subvert the church and Christian institutions, and I think that's exactly what has happened in our country, in our society.
You mean Protestantism?
Listen, I'm
hang on. What would be the central authority?
Self-loathing Protestant.
Yeah,
so
what would be the authority, the self-governing authority of the United States when it came to Christianity, Jacob?
So I don't understand.
The governing authority, the governing body for religion, Christianity inside of the United States. That's not Catholicism. That's not Orthodoxy, is it?
No.
Now, so it could be possible as well that you're drawing a correlate that doesn't even exist here. The correlate being that as we centralize power, that this is going to go against Christianity. My argument back to you is no, as long as you are not centralizing power with Protestants, who then fracture off into 40,000 different denominations. It's the fact that they are not centralized. It's the fact that they're not centralized, actually, which destroys their power. Here's my argument to you. My argument is right this second, if there was one single solid church, which was a Protestant church, let's just call it, for the purpose of this mental exercise, the Church of Martin Luther, okay? Conservatives would then be in charge of the most powerful institution in the United States, which would be that church. Not liberals, not progressives, conservatives would be. And that is what happens when actually you fracture away your power, is that evil men and progressives come in and they seize your institutions and they centralize it against you. You cannot actually defend against the powerful without yourself being powerful. And you have to have some form of collectivism to do that. In this case, I would say Christianity is a great one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Christianity is a bulwark against oppressive regimes, and that's why oppressive regimes try to subvert the church historically. I don't know. But I don't think that Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox churches have exactly protected their societies from their governments becoming tyrannical either. So I'm not sure. No.
Wait, they have. And that's why the first thing that the communists do to the Orthodox Church is what?
Well, they
what did they do to them?
Persecute them.
No, so they took them all. They took the Orthodox Tsar out and they murdered him and his entire family, the Bolsheviks did. And then they went through and systematically slaughtered all of the Orthodox which existed in the East that they could possibly get their hands on, exactly because they were a powerful central church, which could stop communists.
So you're saying that, you're saying
just because they lost. Yeah, just because they lost doesn't mean that the idea that centralizing force, if they had had some sort of like standing army or some sort of warrior class, let's say, they might have been able to stand a much larger chance. They only had a centralized power with the political class. That in and of itself is still a great bulwark. They at least had something. We don't have anything. We're just literally ripe for the plucking, bro. We're ripe for the plucking.
You won't get much disagreement from me that Protestantism is largely a failure in terms of being a bulwark against these things. So I wouldn't have much pushback with you there, other than I just haven't managed to convince myself yet of Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. So, but that's not the purpose of what we're here for today. I think that, yeah, I mean, these are all gradients, right? So, I mean, the American experiment might have lasted longer if it wasn't Protestantism, if it was maybe majority Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. But I still think that the incentive structures of a monopoly of power like that, and again, I think this is biblically based. This is essentially the warning that God gave through Samuel to the Israelites when they asked for a king, because in the book of Judges, they still had government, but it was decentralized. And when they were like, hey, we want a king, we want a centralized authority to solve all our problems for you, God wasn't like, finally, this is what I've been waiting for you guys to ask for. He was like, no, first of all, you're rejecting me as your king. And he's going to take from you. Actually, it's really crucial. He says he's going to take 10% from you, and that's really significant because 10% is what's owed to God. So he's like, he's going to be, it's going to be idolatry. He's going to
but I
take
mean,
what
so
is
what? There's
rightfully mine.
counterexamples to all of that, including judges. Why do we have judges? What were judges?
Well, that was an example of governance.
Yeah, that's what. I mean, what
think,
were they?
Yeah,
though?
listen, there are
what? Hang on. What were judges? What were they?
Well, some of them were like military leaders, and some of them were.
They were a
so
centralized. They were a centralized
I'm not a pacifist,
authority.
Andrew.
Yeah, but I'm saying they were a centralized authority. All of these, hang on. Not only were they a centralized authority, but they were a fantastic centralized authority, and what they were able to do is bring actual justice. What happens is when you whittle away at the government with your stupid libertarian idealism, what you do is you actually destroy centralized power for conservatism. And I'm going to give you an example in real time of how that happens and occurs. You ever hear of the fairness doctrine?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, this is perhaps before your time. But in the 1990s, you may not know this, but the conservatives had taken over all of national radio, all of it, every bit of it.
No, I know this. Yeah.
Yeah, and the liberals came in and said, oh, wait, we want this to be fair, blah, 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 blah. We need more airtime. We need more. It's not fair that conservatives have a monopoly on media. None of that's fair. It was libertarians who whittled away at conservative resistances, saying, no, we should have more of a battle of the ideas. We should have more of the other side's voices coming in here and speaking. We should have more of that. They were whittled away at the conservative power base. Libertarians are solely responsible for the erosion of conservatism inside of the United States because they claim that we're not allowed to have central power. And if we don't have it, the progressives will take it anyway. That's the flaw in your argument. Progressives will take it whether you want them to or not. Conservatives may listen to you, but they have no way to fight back if you don't let them have central power. They can't do it.
It's a lot harder for them to take power if it's not there in the first place, if it's decentralized. Now, you can look at this at different levels, right? So like, yeah, judges, if you go to those specific tribes and areas, then there'd be centralization for a time or in a specific region for a specific dispute. And so I'm not like there are some wacky libertarians who say like, yeah, we shouldn't have any rules or any hierarchies, or even if you have like a local governance, that's oppressive. And I'm not going there. Like I said, my views have evolved over the last couple of years. And so I'm okay with decentralized government that at the local level can actually be pretty active. In fact, some libertarians would question my libertarian credentials because I think at the local level, not only can government be a little bit more hands-on, but I think that the churches should be a big part of that.
Yeah. So aren't universities decentralized?
I mean, some universities, a lot of them get
they're
funding.
they're decentralized.
I don't know. I don't know if that's because I mean a lot of them are connected, right?
Yeah, well, explain how they're centralized, how they're a central position of power other than the soft power that they wield. That's their power, right? But they're not a centralized form of. So in other words, can universities send armed men over to enforce their will?
Well, no, but they're almost like they're just an arm of the bureaucratic leftist progressive.
Well, then so is everything. That's the thing, though, is that this is a problem when you say decentralized power. Try to understand how illogical it is from my perspective, what you're saying. Here's what you're saying. Andrew, inside of society, there are hundreds of millions of people whose ideology is that the state must seize control of everything possible and destroy all religion in order to free mankind from itself and give them a stateless society where we all live for each other. Hundreds of millions of people believe this ideology. In order to combat that, the best thing we can do is make sure that we have less power. That's actually what you're saying to me.
And
how would that combat these people?
If you have, it's easy to hijack institutions where the ability to tax, the ability to seize property, the ability to conscript, and the monopoly of law over a giant landmass with millions of people, when that already exists, it's easy for these leftists to come in and wield those against us, wield those against the church, wield those against the values that you and I would mostly agree
It's
with.
not easy. It's not actually easy for them to do this unless libertarian ideology gets in there and says to them things like, you should not wield force in government for ethics. You should not wield law against the citizens to enforce ethical standards. Rather, people should be able to do whatever they want as long as they're not aggressing on other people. You create this open back door for power to seize your institutions, because what happens is moral men act in the way that you're prescribing. Immoral men refuse to act in the way that you're prescribing. And so what they do is they seize power of those institutions, and you let them right in through the front door. Instead of recognizing this ideology will not go away, the only way to successfully combat the guy on the playground who has the biggest fist is to make sure that you can pound him harder, right?
Yeah, I just don't agree with that characterization of how we got here. Like, I've heard it sounds similar, like Michael Knowles said when he was on Timcast. He was like, "Oh, libertarians duped the conservatives, and this is why we're in the mess we're in today." And I disagree with that. Like, conservatives were hijacked by like the Buckleyites and the neocons, who they weren't trying to. You mean government small?
You mean progressive libertarians? Those are progressive libertarians.
They're not. I mean,
yes, they were.
Them libertarians. That's just like that's making the word libertarian meaningless. If it describes
when you
those
make
people and
when
people like
when
me.
you make an egalitarian, when you make the argument, the pro argument for egalitarian systems, for equity between human beings and egalitarianism, essentially you are moving towards a libertarian paradigm. Libertarians have to concede to some form of egalitarianism and some form of equity. Otherwise, none of your shit's going to work. You have to bake in the assumption, for instance, that people can, sign these contracts, that they can live inside of these societies without there being a threat of force. My argument and contention is that no, they can't. And that all it takes is a single man to say, no, we want their shit. And now you're right for the plucking. You're right for the plucking. That's it. That's the end of it.
Well,
it's done.
So this is where we'll have some crossover, like I alluded to earlier, because I actually think that there's some truth to what you're saying, and I think a lot of libertarians need to learn this lesson. So actually, like I come from like I'm friends with Dave Smith, and I'd say I'm like a Dave Smith style libertarian, and Dave often says that conservatives need to learn a libertarian lesson, and libertarians need to learn a conservative lesson. And I actually think that libertarians are misguided if they think that their ideas can ever come close to reality. And I don't even think like the libertarians who are thinking we're going to have some kind of stateless society need to wake up. There's a lot of people you're watching this video of me earlier today, and I was talking back then in real time when it was happening, and I didn't understand their criticisms at that point. People like from my world, Pete Quinones, Matt Erickson, guys like CJ Engel, who are basically leaving libertarian movement to kind of move more into sort of like your territory. And the reason being that a lot of libertarians are living in fantasy land, basically living in what they would call Ancapistan in their head. And at the time, I kind of didn't realize their point, but over the last couple of years, I've kind of come to see that there's a lot of truth to what they're saying. And I think libertarians need to actually grow up a little bit and realize that, A, we need to work in the real world. I'm not envisioning that in my lifetime that even if all the libertarians magically work together, we're going to have some kind of perfect libertopia come in. But I do think that the answer is still not ultimately down the path of centralizing power. And I would say that the only way that we're going to ultimately
you
fight
don't
back
want a
against
centralized power for religion.
I want a centralized power in terms of a cultural force.
How many churches? Hang on. How many church? Is there only one church?
I mean, there's the body of Christ.
Yeah, that's one, right? How many is that?
I mean, there's the visible church, and then there's the
the body of Christ, though.
Church.
How many bodies of Christ are there?
Ultimately one.
Oh, so it's a monolith.
Right. Well, the kingdom of heaven is a monolith.
Right. So it's a monolith. It sounds like it's very centralized, doesn't it? Sounds like it's very much this. We all need to be one thing, right?
With that power.
Well, I don't understand. Who's the church?
Well, the church is still men, though, right?
Oh,
Still
okay. So who is it?
individuals.
It's
Who is
men,
what?
and how many are there supposed to be?
How many?
How many
what?
churches are there supposed to be? One. And what's it comprised of? Men. Very strange, very strange. This God character that you're pointing out, who doesn't like this whole monopoly on things, gives us a single church for all men to join. All men to join this one thing, which creates a monopoly. In fact, I could never give you a better definition of a monopoly than everybody does this one thing. What possibly could be a better example of a monopoly than that?
I mean, I'm a Christian. I'm not sure. I don't disagree with you. The path is narrow, right? Like, and even many who think they know God, Jesus will say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." So, yeah, like,
If all
so
people
yeah, the
joined
kingdom.
this one church, would that create this massive power monopoly?
Well, yeah, I mean, if everybody in the world became Christian, then
That
I mean,
thing
you
that you
could say it
want?
became a monopoly.
Yeah,
Well,
the thing
yeah,
that you want. So wait, so
right. But
let
you
me
can't
just
put
get
the
this
cart.
right.
Hold
Let
on.
me get this right, Jacob. You want everybody in the world to join this monopoly, creating the largest monopoly of force in the history of the world. That's your libertarian solution to the crisis of planet. I just want to make sure I got
That's
that
not my.
clear. Is
Hold on.
that
No, no, no,
correct?
no, no. No, we're moving the goalposts here. I'm not
Oh,
saying
I
that
don't
that's
think
my.
we are.
You're conflating what I want with what I'm actually prescribing in terms of what is realistic.
Why wouldn't
So
you
yeah, what do
prescribe
I
what you want?
Well, I mean, you can have lofty goals, but that doesn't mean that's what I think is realistically going to happen.
Yeah, okay, but that's a descriptive is. We're talking about ought. You're saying people
Right.
ought to all be Christians, right?
Okay, I think we should start with the idea that we should make as many Christians as possible.
So
That we should be
everybody ought to
growing
be
the
a
kingdom of
Christian?
God.
Everybody ought to be a Christian?
Yeah, I don't
Oh,
think we
okay,
should
so
use force to
everybody ought
accomplish that
to be a
goal.
Christian, and if everybody ought to be a Christian, everybody
I said that in my opening
did,
statement. I said the
and yeah,
prescription for the
right, right. And if
unsaved is to
everybody
become saved.
became a Christian, right, you would have the largest monopoly of force on planet Earth. Correct?
I mean, sure. I mean, that's almost what the Bible describes. That we're going to have I mean, not getting into eschatology, but there'll be
Mhm.
a reign with Christ with his body. Sure.
Super,
When that day
super,
comes.
well, super weird. So you would agree that this would have to come in stages, right? Like 50% of planet Earth was Christian, then 60% of planet Earth was Christian, then 70% was Christian, et cetera, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more of an amillennialist than a post-millennialist, although I'm an optimistic amillennialist. So I'm not sure that we will have this incremental move to 100% and then usher in, the physical kingdom on Earth. If that happens, great. I'm not sure it's going to be exactly like that, but if it
Okay,
happens,
well,
that would be
let's phrase
fine.
it a different way. Let's assume right now 10% of planet Earth were Christians, right? Let's just assume it. It's hypothetical, Jacob. I'm not saying it's true, just hypothetical. We're going to assume 10% of planet Earth are Christians. Would you want it to be 20%?
Absolutely,
Would you want it to be 30%?
absolutely.
Okay, so if incrementally it went tomorrow from 10%, hypothetically, to 20%, thus doubling the amount of force that it could apply, you would want that, wouldn't you?
I would want the increase of Christianity, sure. Yeah.
And would those Christians then be the people who were in your government?
Sure.
And when they were in your government, would they be creating your policies?
I'm not against, like I said in my intro, I'm not against Christian government, but I think we have
No.
to get into the details of how that's defined.
Sure.
So-
I get it. But you would want all of your government to be Christians then.
Sure, yeah.
And you would want everybody inside of your government who applied force to be Christians, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Okay, great. So then what we have established is that Jacob, the libertarian, wants Christians to have a complete and total monopoly on all force on planet Earth if he can do it. This is some real mind-blowing libertarianism that you got going on here, Jacob. You have really cracked the code with this one, brother. I wish I had been able to go back in time and apply that I was also a libertarian who believed in a uniform singular church as a prescription for everyone on planet Earth. I'm sure that I wouldn't have gotten laughed out of the room at all.
Yeah.
But
Again,
anyway,
you're
go ahead.
You're still moving the goalposts from. You're asking me, do I want more Christians, and then would that consequently mean more Christians in government? And
Yes, I'm
therefore,
sorry that there's
then you jump
logical
to the.
entailments. Those are logical entailments, Jacob.
So,
That's
so,
correct.
Andrew, so are you saying you don't want more Christians, and therefore to create more Christians in government?
No.
Okay, then what is your prescription?
Well, I mean, my prescription, what I've always said is that, well, maybe I misunderstood your question. Say your question again.
So, I mean, because honestly, I mean, I've heard you describe yourself as a Christian nationalist, but I know that's not like one thing. People believe different things.
Yeah,
But
I think I caught. I
Christian
think what I thought you said was, would you recommend that less people became, or more people became Christian? I said yes, but maybe that's not what you asked. So what did you actually ask?
I asked, you would want more people to become Christian, and therefore more people in your government to be Christian.
Yeah.
Right.
And I want all those force applicators to be governed by Christians. And if they're
Sure.
moral men, I don't really give a shit how big the government gets. I don't really care if they have a monopoly on force. And I don't really care if you cannot defend yourself adequately against those moral men. I don't care.
I think if we have devout Christians following biblical principles in government, that they will use force to uphold property rights, and I don't see a biblical justification for initiating force against non-violent.
Yeah, but
sinners.
what makes that libertarian? That makes that centralized power again. That's just, all you're saying is that if Christians held centralized power, that they would enforce property rights with centralized power. Yeah, I agree. What's your point?
Well, I mean, I think you were defining libertarianism in a different way than I am.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think we just went over it ad nauseum. Decentralization of power over to limited property rights with smaller government. That is what you said.
So I don't think there would be there would still be different government across the world, and they would all be different Christian. There'd be a Christian government, and I ideally wouldn't want a American government. I'd probably want it more granular than that. So like I live in Pennsylvania, so I'd want a Pennsylvanian government that is Christian, that would be neighboring with the Maryland government that is.
Would they all be part?
Well,
but feasibly, if you could, would they all be part of the one truth body of Christ? In Pennsylvania and in Maryland.
Those are different, but those are different. You have the sphere of the church, and then you
wait, that's really, hang on, that's really weird. Because if you had localized leadership, you would have things like bishops, and you would have clergy who would cross over these states, and they would make like cross-state policy, right? They would make cross-state prescriptions for how morality should be run. And then, well, before you knew it, Jacob, they would be working together and uniting with each other in order to continue to spread their reach so that more people became part of that one church, right?
We should be growing the church, absolutely.
Right. So what happens is all you're doing is saying this. Here's your entire position. Andrew, I want a centralized authority of moral Christian men who then go on to take over the entirety of the United States and rule it as moral people. That's your actual position.
Right. I think we're just disagreeing that you think that's not commensurate with libertarianism.
It's not. It's not libertarianism. What is libertarianism then? Is it big monopoly government unified under a single religion? Is that libertarianism?
Well, no, I've already
Jacob?
said I would. No, because you're saying that the church would be the government, and I'm saying no, the governments would be separate from the church. The church would interact with the government.
Nope, not possible. You cannot, if you're part of a single unified body of government. Go ahead, man.
So yes, the body of Christ as the church, yes, would be like in a spiritual sense as the body of Christ governing that nation, so to speak, if it was the majority.
And Christian where does nation. Culture come from?
Culture comes from people.
Comes from theology. Culture's downwind of theology, right. And government's downwind of culture. So you're saying that the entire culture and the entire monopoly of force, the entire foundational root for your ideology is a singular unified religion among men who have a monopoly.
But there would still be different institutions. There would still be.
Why? No, what? How could you have a different institution and be part of one body?
They would be part of one body in a Christian sense, in a biblical sense of being one body of Christ.
Yeah.
But then, in terms of what happens in human society, you would have, you'd still have different spheres of and institutions of human government and courts and things like that, and they wouldn't be part of just one universal church across the entire nation.
I think that they would. I think that everything which informed all of those judges and everybody else's morality would be that one unified church. And they would risk a penalty of excommunication should they govern in such a way that one unified church didn't like, right? Almost like checks and balances in a way.
Yeah, I find it unlikely that it would be one church. I mean, like you could say
no. I'm saying let's just assume for a second that it's almost logically impossible. Not quite, but almost. Like it's never going to happen as a descriptive is. That is what you want to happen, though.
Yeah, it would be great if all of the theological divides between Christians were solved. We became one unified body. Sure.
Right. So, I mean, if this is the ultimate ought,
Like I said,
then
we
why aren't
have
we
some.
moving towards that? I don't get that. Why shouldn't you
I
move
think we
towards that
should
then?
move towards that. And
Well,
like
then
I said,
great.
we
Then
do.
then you're a Christian nationalist. You're coming over to my side, right? We should be moving towards a singular church, and the body and authority of all people in the United States should be governed by the ethics of that church, and they should have a complete and total monopoly of force. I love this, Jacob. We have completely solved this problem. You're no longer a libertarian. You're coming over to the dark side, right?
No, I think that, I mean, ultimately, I'd have questions for you in terms of your Christian nationalism, because I haven't actually heard your Christian nationalism. I've actually talked to, so like, our CEO at Libertarian Christian Institute, we were talking the other night, and I was describing my views as almost Christian nationalism light, in a way. So again, I do think we have some crossover, and I think there's some libertarians in the chat who actually, yeah, who are like, oh, you're not a real libertarian. Well, I don't care. I'm still incorporating a lot of libertarian political philosophy into what I'm prescribing and what I'm moving towards. But I'm a Christian first. I'm not a ideologically possessed libertarian. I guess ultimately what it comes down to
We've
is,
almost got the rest of that nonsense beaten out of your skull, so you can just come the rest of the way over to moving towards the ought that you want to see. This is the ought that you want to see. Why aren't we moving towards the ought that you want to see, bro?
Listen, the devil is in the details in terms of that. I still think that it needs to be stressed that I think there is no biblical justification for using civil governance at any level to initiate violence against nonviolent people. And that is ultimately what makes me a libertarian, is that I reject the use of political violence against peaceful people.
Well, then who gets to define? Well, who gets to define what violence is then? You?
I would say by Christian norms should be the ideal.
Okay, wait,
And this is
wait,
where,
wait,
this is
hang
where
on, wait, what? Wait, what? So wait a second. You want the defining ideals for what constitutes violence to be done by who?
Christians. I don't
would that require some sort of centralization and force again, Jacob?
I mean, listen, I think even with, well, I shouldn't say this because Protestantism is a mess. Between like the good Protestant branches and Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, there's really not any disagreement over major moral issues. So, I mean, I think we can create a sort of, this is sort of what like Doug Wilson talks about, who I have disagreements with, but he talks about like a mere Christendom, and he describes himself almost as a theocratic libertarian in a sense, because he's trying to create a just sort of like a Christian consensus, right?
No, Jacob, what are you going to do with all of those non-violent atheists who just have a different definition of what violence is?
No, I don't have a problem. If someone commits violence, like steals property, and they say, well, in my view, it's not violence, I don't care. We'll use force to stop them.
Oh, okay. So got it. So essentially what you're saying is this, is that you are going to be the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes violence. A good example of this, for instance, is going to be abortion. Do you think that atheists and progressives think that it's violence to abort a child?
A lot of them, well, I mean, some of them pretend that it's violence, and then they still end up saying, but it should be illegal anyway. So practically most of them don't think it's violence.
Yeah, most of them don't think it's violence, right? So if you, the person who tells them, Jacob, well, listen, anytime people perpetuate violence from a civil authority on those who are non-violent, they're wrong. That atheist progressive is going to be like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. By the way, here, suck this out of me real quick, Doc. And that's not violence, Jacob. How are you going to convince them that it is violence, Jacob? Are you going to, and even if they don't think it's violence, they don't think that it is, are you going to use violence anyway?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is that really
libertarianism is fundamentally against the initiation of aggression. The unborn are still people.
Well, that's nice. And you get to determine what that means, though. And you haven't told me why we should yield. Why should we yield to that?
Someone's going to determine right now.
Yeah, but why should they yield to that, Jacob? Why should they yield to your definition of violence? Why?
Well, so this is where your prescriptions and descriptions are right, and I agree with you that, in a sense, in a society, might does make right.
That's right.
And this is why we do need to create a Christian majority and consensus.
That's right. So here's the difference between us. I say this. I say, oh, yeah, you don't think that that's violence? That's great. I'm going to institute the civil authority against you anyway. Fuck off.
Right, on abortion, I
Fuck
would
off,
mostly agree
right?
with you.
Yeah, but you know, no, I'm saying to you that prescriptively, not even descriptively, that prescriptively it's okay to use civil authority against nonviolent people because these people who are, quote, nonviolent would only be able to follow whatever your definition of nonviolence is. If they followed their own, you would still consider it an act of violence. You have not given an argument for why they should yield to yours. Why should they yield to what you consider violence to be instead of what they consider it to be? Like, for instance, they could do human sacrifice, right, Jacob? And say, this isn't violence. Our God hath ordained that I take this guy up here, cut his fucking heart out, and sacrifice it to Ra. That's not violence. Boss, he said he wanted to. There's nothing violent going on here. You wouldn't take the civil authority anyway and put him to the sword, Jacob?
I would have no problem using civil authorities to stop human sacrifice.
So what is your argument to him for why it is violence? Why should he yield to you?
So right now we're not too far off where I wouldn't have an argument or even a monopoly of force to stop him. But I'm hoping we can turn the tide on that. And yeah, so this is, again, I'll repeat, I agree with the framework you often use, because I've listened to you a lot, that yes, and this is really just a restating of the idea that politics is downstream from culture. And there's some interplay because politics can influence culture as well. But ultimately, yeah, like if we have an immoral people who redefine things like the killing of the unborn, or human sacrifice, or other things that are aggression, and they say these aren't aggression, that is wrong. And if we could get the government to use force to stop them, that would be great. But we don't have the majority right now to easily do that, and so we need to focus on doing that.
But Jacob, I just want to let you know, and I didn't cut you off while you went through the entirety of that. You didn't actually answer my question. Why should 40% or 30% of the population, which is atheist right now, okay, let's assume it's somewhere in there. I don't think it's that high, but let's assume that it is 30%. Why should they yield to your definition of violence instead of their own? Why? Why ought they?
Why ought they?
Mm-hmm.
They're wrong by Christian standards.
So
right now I would say.
So wait. So hang on. You realize it's not an argument to say because they're wrong. Why? You have to tell me why they should. Why ought they?
Well, so listen, you try to use words and persuasion and reason, but if people are beyond reason, then you do have to resort to force.
Yeah. So essentially this, right? Do what I fucking say or else. Libertarianism with Jacob Winograd, ladies and gentlemen. Do what I say by my moral standards.
Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff is like libertarianism 101. And yes, you can use force to tell people.
Yeah, but the problem is you're acting within this nebulous gray area of what is or is not violence. And you're saying that they ought to uphold your standard for what violence is because you just really fucking want them to, Jacob. Jacob, hang on. Because you just really want them to. So tell me why they actually should, other than because otherwise Jacob's going to go over there with an army that has a bunch of fucking boom sticks and make you.
Listen, I come from the libertarian tradition of Rothbard and the Mises Institute guys, and those libertarians like Hans Hermann Hoppe, they've always understood the importance of culture and the idea that libertarianism does not work without a moral people and really without a Christian people. And so, yeah, I am willing to impose the Christian worldview through governance. I just happen to think that the Christian worldview is commensurate with libertarian principles.
Yeah, because Christian principles are do what I want or else, right?
Well, yes, there is an aspect to human society that you describe well, that you do have to, like, there are people who aren't going to agree. Now listen, I'll make a caveat here. What I am not going to justify creating is like some kind of like Christian imperialism where it's like we need to go halfway across the world and tame these savages or something like that. I'm not going to create like Christian nationalism light, my version of Christian libertarianism, or whatever you want to call it, wouldn't justify that. I don't think we should. I still think that the emphasis should be on making these things as decentralized as possible, as local as possible, as ground up as possible. But yeah, like at some point, at whatever, whether it's at the state or the locality, there will still be
centralized authority.
There's still going to be at some level a centralized authority.
Yeah, there's going to be a centralized authority, and if they don't adhere to your standards of Christian ethics, they're conducting violence, and you're going to go over there, and you're going to go over there with boom sticks and make them fucking comply. Yeah, there does, Jacob. There has to be law. It has to
be enforced.
Yeah, but Jacob, I agree. Jacob, I agree with all of that. That there has to be law, has to be enforced, has to be a central authority to enforce that law. There has to be judges, has to be cops, has to be law enforcement, has to be military, there has to be all this stuff in order to do all of that. But you still, I just want to let you know, this is the third time I'm going to ask this, because you actually have not answered the question in all 3 times I've asked it. Within the nuance of what Jacob considers violence to be, why ought atheists, if you told an atheist you ought to do what my version of violence is, which includes like a Plan B pill, let's say. You can't take a Plan B pill. That's violence, right? Isn't that violence?
I don't remember the exact science of the Plan B pill.
Okay, the abortion pill. The abortion pill.
Right. If it's an actual abortion pill. Now, I also will make a distinction between what is morally permissible and what is prudent, because I would also have a problem with things that would resemble the war on drugs. And there's some things that might be morally permissible to say, hey, the law could do this, but it doesn't mean that it's practical. It doesn't mean that you can actually implement it without some greater violation of rights. So there's a little bit of nuance there. But in terms of the heart of your question, and I want to make sure I answer it this time. You're asking why they listen to me if they disagree with me.
Nope, that's not my question, and I'm going to be hyper specific here.
Okay.
Jacob says, my moral grounding ethics for what violence is needs to be adhered to by you, the atheist. And my reason for that is...
Christianity is right.
Oh. And if you don't follow it, we're going to make you follow it.
I mean, I will make people follow the parts of Christianity that can be imposed by force, which is essentially the libertarian parts of do not murder and do not steal.
Yeah. If you do, but you have to understand that within their ethical framework, they're saying, no, this isn't true. You're wrong. You have not demonstrated, hang on, Jacob, you have not demonstrated to me that this is actually a murder or violence of any kind. You have not demonstrated that, so therefore it is not, we're not going to do it. And Jacob says, yes, you are, or else. Because if you don't, we're going to come fucking make you. Right, Jacob?
If we had the Christian majority to make that happen, sure. If we didn't, it might be a little bit tougher.
Yeah, but you would prefer that we did.
Yeah, I would prefer people not be murdered, and I'd prefer property rights to be respected.
Welcome to Christian populism. Welcome to the actual conservative movement, where we're not so stupid that we don't understand that the application of force from the civil authority to enforce things that we consider to be moral, even if you don't, is not only necessary, but we're going to move society towards that. Because the problem you have here is that you have become the god of the system. Because what you say is, listen, you people, all of you, have to adhere to what I consider violence to be. If you do not adhere to what I consider violence to be, I will use violence on you. Pretty based authoritarianism, Jacob.
I mean, listen, like I said in my intro, I'm not against the just use of authority. There is a just use of authority from the Christian worldview. I am a Christian. So,
okay.
But it's just a matter of defining those things. And I would still be, in my opinion, a libertarian who says that, no, if someone is smoking weed or even shooting up crack and not hurting anyone, I'm not going to go use force to stop them. If people are, we didn't get much into the marriage stuff.
What?
If someone's shooting up crack and they're not hurting anyone.
Okay, now I get it. Yeah. So let's make sure, going into marriage then, so gay marriage good? They can do that, it's fine, you don't have a problem with it?
I'm not going to use force to stop gay people from getting together, although
Why not?
I agree with your prescription that we should divorce the institution of marriage from the state, because all that's led from that is that the state is subverted and destroyed.
I'm sorry. Why ought I allow gays to get married? Why ought I?
There's no violation of property rights. There's no act of aggression against another person. They
Yeah,
are
but by my definition, there is.
well that
And
I
that's
think
what matters, is my definition, right, Jacob? My definition of what these things are is what matters. And therefore, as long as it falls under the purview of what I consider to be moral, then it's time for the mighty sword to come out and enforce my will, isn't it, Jacob?
right. So this is again where and I'm not dodging your question. I'm trying to agree with you. Is that your descriptors about how society operates through a sort of might makes right framework is not wrong. Like this is something that like Stirner talked about, who's a classical anarchist thinker who very left wing and degenerate. I don't. He's not my guiding libertarian philosopher, but he made that observation too. It's something libertarians know, and I've even talked about on my show that there's an aspect of society that is very much like there is what's morally normative and what we prescribe, and then there are
Well, let's
prescriptors and
dive into
descriptors.
this absurdity. I'll be as good faith as possible for this, right? Even though I feel like pointing this kind of absurdity out over and over again has been fun, I would like to dive into this a little bit more. Let's assume for a second, I assume that you think that a person marrying an animal is not okay because that would be a transgression of the non-aggression principle, correct? Because the animal can't consent and all that stuff.
I don't know.
You don't know?
I will admit that that's not one I've really thought about. I don't know if animals really have
you don't know
rights. So
they don't. So they're your property. Why can't you marry? Why can't you marry one, bro?
Rights are fictitious anyway. But
yeah, so why can't they marry a goat, bro?
I don't know that I would want to wield civil authority to stop them
From marrying a goat?
I mean, it's the
You're not sure that you would let the civil authority go in and prevent people from marrying their barnyard animals, Jacob?
I mean, that's not the hill I would die on. So if my state and community passed laws preventing that, I'm not going to be acting to repeal them.
Can they go marry a dead body, Jacob?
No, I'd say
why not?
The dead body is still a human body, and even though the soul is left, it's still not.
It's nothing. It's just a husk, right? Like if you were gonna die for certain, you were with your child, and you were like up in a snowbank, like in Alive, the movie Alive, and you were gonna starve, and your kid was gonna starve if you didn't eat one of the pilots. I mean, it's bon appetit time, right? It is bon appetit. You are grabbing a fork and a knife, and you're getting the grill going. And man, that kid is going to make it through that winter in the Alps, isn't he?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would probably draw the line at desecrating human bodies. I don't think that
you wouldn't eat a dead body if it meant feeding your kid. You wouldn't do it. I'd do it.
Well,
I'd eat that fucker's face. You know what I mean? If that was the only way I was getting out, right? Like I would go home and I'd tell my wife, I'd be like, "Look, baby, you know how much I love you? You know how much I love you? When I was up on that mountaintop, I was getting home and I ate a dude's fucking face. I ate his face to get back to you, baby. Right? Like, I mean, I would eat their face, right? If that's what it took to get off the mountain, I would do that, right? But you know why? I would never do that to somebody who was alive, though, because a dead body has no more moral value, really. The only thing about desecration which comes, that's a punishment, a crime against yourself, right? It's a crime against you.
I guess it's context specific. Like if you find a dead body out in the wilderness versus like you go into a hospital and go into the morgue and pull out a dead body. Like I think those are two different things by, even by property rights and contract law. So
yeah, no, I get it. So, but let's assume for a second then, under this scenario, that a dude who happened to be a homosexual wrote out in his will that he wanted some other guy to marry his dead body and then have sex with it if he wanted to.
I mean, yeah, that's pretty degenerate.
Yeah,
I'd like to think that doesn't happen, but
if it did,
but if it did, I mean, so again, is that a law that I would die on the hill of preventing?
You wouldn't.
No.
Yeah, no way. I mean, There's no way that Jacob's gonna send the civil authority over to tell the next Manson family member that he can't have sex with of his former partner's corpse and marry it. I mean, that would be crazy.
Yeah, I think so. So can you draw so like, let's say for sake of argument, I grant that, like, yeah, we should have a law against that and the other examples you've given. So why does that extend to gay marriage then too?
Because the only argument that you can make for why a person shouldn't marry a goat, and if you believe that a goat is simply property, and you must, because obviously you will eat a goat's face and you will have no moral qualms about doing so. You'll eat it for breakfast, won't you? You'll wake up in the morning. If somebody served a delicious goat face on a table, you're going to gobble that shit down so fast and down a glass of ice cold orange juice with it. So the thing is, since we give them no moral consideration under this worldview, you would have to concede the only reason you would stop them from marrying a goat and having sex with it, even though you would allow them to eat it, is because it's a crime against themselves. And since it's a crime against themselves, you have a moral duty to prevent that crime against themselves. You would have to make the same exact argument that homosexuality is a crime against yourself.
Yeah, I would probably, so what I would probably do for all the situations except for the gay marriage would be definitely in favor of at least some form of ostracism, to say, like, if you, I mean, listen, I'm not going to go, like, I don't want to create a surveillance state where we're spying on people's homes to see if they're screwing goats.
I mean, we don't have it now. We don't
stuff.
have a surveillance state for that now, but it's certainly a crime to screw a goat and you go to jail. The evil civil authority that you're against currently will throw you in jail for fucking a goat, Jacob. Should they not do that? I mean, are they out of line there, Jacob? Are they out of line? Do we need to stop these tyrants, Jacob?
I'm gonna err on the side of saying that no, we don't need to stop them there. Although some libertarians might say that I'm deviating from libertarianism there. But again, I'm not ideologically possessed by libertarianism. If I lose my libertarian credentials because I'm not dying on the hill of banning people screwing animals, then and at the same time, I would hope, like, the prescription I have is, like, we need to be ultimately working to make a society more virtuous, more Christian, and if we're at the point where it's like, man, we need to stop people from screwing goats, then we have a lot of work to do as a church. And I think that that the cultural decay, if we're at that point, is a that's
well, I
worrisome.
hate to be the bearer of bad news, Jacob, but right this second, there are people who fuck goats.
Yeah, well,
here in the United States, and when they go to jail, I think they belong there, Jacob. I think they should go to jail for that.
There's probably a good argument to be made that people who have hit that level of, like, mental derangement might not be of sound mind. It might be a danger to other people. Wait.
I don't understand. Hang on. If an animal has absolutely no value, right? Its only value is going in your tum-tum, right? You can literally eat it. You have no problem with that. If a guy, like, here, let's answer it this way. Let's assume a guy breeds dogs. Okay? He's breeding dogs. He doesn't want any impurities. This dog has a beautiful batch of puppies, little puppy dogs, and they got the big doe eyes, and they haven't even opened their eyes quite yet. They're sniffing around looking for mama's teat. And he goes, oh shit, there's a defect in all of these. One of their big toes, it's just a little too long. That's going to create an impurity in the breed. So he grabs all the little puppies and he fucking drowns them. Right in his front yard, he just drowns them. By the way, that happens in real time all the time for service dogs, things like that. You don't have any problem with that, right? It's not an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have... the animal question's a tricky one, and I'll have to be somewhat agnostic on where I stand on that. That's not one I've given a whole lot of thought to, so I wouldn't give a definitive answer. But
I mean, right now they do that, and it's because the animal is your property. Unless you give it some type of value other than your property, right? You would have to explain to me why you couldn't marry your property. You'd have to explain that to me. What the actual problem with that would be under your civil authority, except that you're doing something bad to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this comes down to there's going to be like there is no neutrality in culture. There's going to be a culture. And I do think that there are some cultural norms that are going to be imposed. Right now, we have cultural norms that are trying to be imposed that are awful, that we should push back against. And so the libertarians that I referenced before, guys like Hans Hermann Hoppe, have talked about, ways within a libertarian legal order to prevent this kind of degeneracy from being allowed within your community. Now, does that mean that you then need to then go, like, if they become the outcasts of society, they're living in some like cave in a mountain or something, like, should we go hunt them down and kill them? Like, I wouldn't be an advocate.
Or should we let them utilize our institutions to get married? If they're outcasts, I don't get it, Jacob. Are they? If they're outcasts living in a cave somewhere, being ostracized from society, why are we letting them use our institutions in order to get married again?
It's interesting to talk about animals and dead bodies, but I still don't see how that becomes consistent.
Because I'm going to explain. I'll explain.
Do have rights. Well, again, the difference I see is that human beings, like, where I think it's a little bit ambiguous with the case of the animal and the dead body. With the case of gay marriage, I don't see the same ambiguity. Those are living beings.
I'm going to explain it to you so that there is no ambiguity.
All right,
you can only view an animal one of two ways. Either it has no moral value or it has moral value. And if it does have moral value, you have to assign some kind of moral value to it. I don't know what. Hang on. Let me finish so that you understand the position.
All right.
So if it's either going to have moral value or it's not. How much moral value? That's debatable, but it either is or it isn't. By the law of logic, the law of excluded middle, it either is or it is not. And that's it, right? It can't be both. So it either has moral value or it does not. Under your libertarian framework, it does not. So if that is the case and it's just property, that's it, then the only way you could actually prosecute a person for fucking his own property would be if you said, this is bad for you. It's a crime against yourself. If this is the case, I would use the same argument about prostitution and homosexuality as a crime against yourself, just like fucking the goat. So either the goat has moral value and is not property, or it does not have moral value and it is property. You tell me which.
Well, I mean, the one thing that came to mind is that although, yes, they either have moral value or don't, you could even say they have moral value. It doesn't make it equal to human value.
Didn't say it did.
But in terms of, if we're going with the level where they don't, again, writers like Hoppe have discussed how at community level, and even if you had like something like an incorporated city, you could have through contract law, that basically people have already agreed to by contract that these are things that they're not going to do in this community, and if they violate that, then they're ostracized.
Yeah, but I don't want communities around the fuck goats, even if they have it be by contract, Jacob.
Right. So this is where
I don't even want that. I don't want them to have that, Jacob. I think it's a crime against humanity for you to fuck goats. So no.
I'm not going to create a Christian bureaucratic state that's going around looking for degeneracy wherever it can find it to stomp out. In terms of like, if there's a small collective living out in the woods being degenerate, if they're not hurting anybody, I'm not sure that.
I'm sorry. Is this whole nation your community?
No, I was talking more on a decentralized.
Yeah, I know, but like right now, is this whole nation your community?
I mean, it's sort of an imposed community.
But is it your community or isn't it? Like, are you an American and you exercise the rights of an American? You have some form of Americana. You at least believe that your countrymen are American, right?
I mean, we live in America, and we're told we have citizenship, so sure.
Okay, so if this is your community, then why don't you put that outcast status in right now, right this second, within the community that you live in, Jacob?
You just conflated description and prescription again. Like, yeah, it is true that right now the society I live in, we're sort of forced into this American community, but that's not really the prescription I want in terms of governance or societal.
Well, regardless of the size of the community, I'm just granting the argument. Let us assume for a second that we have Jacob's worldview implemented and that we're going with community. You can have communities the size of the United States, correct? There's actually nothing stopping that from happening, is there?
I don't know. That's
You don't know? You don't know if a community could be as big as the United States? Could it at least be as big as Canada or Mexico? If a community could be as big as Canada or Mexico, is it okay for that community to ostracize these people and run them out, Jacob, and run them into caves like you want to do?
I don't think you can have in terms of the sort of community I was describing in a libertarian sense, I don't think you can have a unified contract law that extends that far in terms of geographic mass.
Why not?
I mean, I guess in theory you could, but just I don't think that's what would happen.
That seems practical to me. Have you ever heard of some of the British trade unions which existed? Their corporate reach was that of nations. By the way, let me give you an example right now of Walmart. China considers Walmart its own country. It trades with Walmart as a country. It doesn't trade with Walmart as an individual corporation. It allocates it as a country to do business with it. Not even kidding. That's how big Walmart is. And it has contracts with all of these different nations utilizing contract law. It's its own community, you could say. Has its own employees, has its own bylaws, has its own internal contracts, has its own everything. It's its own kind of covenant community, you could say. Even has anti-theft people who work round the clock. It has CTV footage inside of its various communities to make sure that people can't take goods away from anyone else. It utilizes and pays local law enforcement to come in and seize people who are disruptors. I mean, it's basically the libertarian utopia when you get right down to it, Jacob.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you had some theoretical sense, some giant corporation that spanned that far and wide, that everyone had agreed to that rule, then I guess you could try to enforce it. It just doesn't seem practical to me.
I mean, Walmart does enforce it. It seems very practical. Like if Walmart China said, no homosexuals allowed, right? It could definitely enforce that, couldn't it?
Okay,
it could definitely run them out of that community, couldn't it? It could definitely be like, no way.
Yeah, I don't know that that's the what I'd be advocating for from Christian principles.
Yeah, no, I know. But the problem is that your Christian principles seem to contradict with your libertarian principles. Here's how. There's two great ways that you're doing this. The first way that you're contradicting your own Christian principles is by the nuance of what is violence. You are taking a pacifistic approach with the NAP, while at the same time, in contradiction, saying that people must adhere to what your version of violence is, or else you will aggress against them. Period. That is two contradicting principles at play. That's one. The second contradiction that you find yourself in is that you can't make a determination as to whether or not a person can violate their own property or not, because it could potentially be a crime against themselves. Here's another example of how I can play into this so that you understand the crime against yourself. If your brother wanted to end his own life, would you stop him?
Yeah.
Why?
I think you have a duty to protect people from violence.
Wait a second.
Including if they're trying to commit violence against themselves. But
wait, I think don't you own yourself, Jacob? Who owns you except you, Jacob?
I think there's a difference between sexual degeneracy and actual acts of violence against yourself.
Don't you own yourself? Isn't your entire argument for drugs that you own yourself, so therefore you should be able to do whatever you want to yourself? Why can't you end yourself if you own yourself?
If you see someone in the moment who is doing drugs in a way that is lethal to them, you could stop them and take them to a hospital. I think that would be justified.
Yeah, but every time they do drugs, it's the potential to be lethal, Jacob.
True. Just like anything, when you use force, you have to be able to, act on some kind of degree of reasonability. Same with like self-defense. Like it has to be you can't be like, oh, he called me stupid, so I pulled my gun out and shot him. Like it has to be like a credible threat for you to act in self-defense, and there'd have to be a credible evidence of he was literally on death's door, not like
bro, this is so weird. I don't get this. I don't get this at all. Do you own yourself or not?
In a legal sense, yes.
Okay, in a spiritual sense, do you own yourself?
In a spiritual sense, everything belongs to God. So
Okay, everything belongs to you. So you don't own yourself spiritually. You just own yourself legally.
Yeah.
So then the spiritual duty should take precedent over the legal duty in your worldview.
Well, the spiritual duty is for there to be in God's order. He has ordered society in such a way that we have these, uh, systems of governance, these different spheres. And so, because, and I would say that God is the ultimate owner of everything, but that he has bestowed upon us the gift of being created in his image and being of our own sound mind and will, and has ordered society as such that we act as self-owners.
Can you sell your soul, Jacob?
I guess.
Yeah. So who owns it?
Well, I guess this would get a little bit into different soteriologies because I'm reformed. So I think that I think ultimately, if I'm part of the elect, I can't actually sell my soul. But now we're open in a whole different whole different can of worms there.
So yeah, before we
go ahead.
Before we open that can of worms, I just want to let you guys know that we are at about an hour and 15 minutes for this back and forth. So I just wanted to see, do you guys want to keep going?
Yeah, we should get into to closers here after the final point. So here, I'm just going to give you one final point on this. The reason I asked this question, I agree that would open up kind of a wider theological debate, which maybe should be had, but we're not going to be able to have it now. If self-ownership is critical to the non-aggression principle, and I'm going to emphatically state that it can't even work absent the belief in self-ownership, then you are in a third contradiction, which is that you would stop a person who owns themselves from doing whatever they wanted to themselves, thus violating their property rights, the very thing which you claim you want to uphold, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Property rights need to be upheld.
Yeah. So that's I would say that's a contradiction, but unless you have something, a rebuttal to that.
I didn't follow it. Just if you can do it briefly.
The non-aggression principle relies on you having self-ownership.
Yes.
However, if you're willing to violate somebody else's self-ownership by preventing them from eliminating themselves, right, then what you are doing is saying that they do not own themselves. There's some higher duty than just self-ownership. So what you're doing is violating their right to self-ownership.
Right, but libertarianism shouldn't be viewed as some religion. And I think that even within libertarian literature, they say you can violate property rights if there's some kind of higher moral quandary at stake. Like if there is a if my son was on someone else's property and he was in imminent danger, I would trespass and violate their property rights to save my son, right? And first of all, the odds of them being
but that could be prescribed. That could be prescribed under the emergencies of the law and not actually violate the non-aggression principle. However, it would always violate the non-aggression principle the second you take away that a person no longer owns themselves. You're now in contradiction. You cannot have the non-aggression principle and not own yourself. The two, you can't do it. Who would you be aggressing?
You can't own yourself if you're dead, though. So if I gotta stop you from killing yourself, I'm not sure
but you own yourself clear up until your life is gone. And who else besides you, if you own yourself, would have a right to eliminate you other than you?
Yeah, I mean, again, there might be something there. I know we have to go to the questions. Again, this is where I would say that I'm not a ideologically possessed libertarian. If the point that you were trying to make is that I am not the perfect 100% across the board ideologically possessed
No, that's not my point. My point is that your Christian ethics conflict with your libertarian principles. And I've showed you 3 different examples of contradiction between the two. You are yielding to higher spiritual values over the libertarianism. This is because of this conflict. The two cannot coexist. It is impossible because your spiritual duty is to stop somebody who's about to unalive themselves. And that violates their self-ownership. Therefore, the principle of non-aggression cannot apply. You are aggressing on them.
I would kind of agree, and I can go more in my closing statement, but I would say that I just think there's a distinction between violating self-ownership to prevent someone from killing themselves and violating self-ownership to stop people who are in a gay relationship. So,
Yeah, well, okay. All right. I'll yield to that. We can get into closings.
All right.
Generally, how this is done in closing, so you know, Jacob, because you got to open first, and I went second, I get to close last. That's usually how that's done. So, or I'm sorry, the opposite, right? You get to close last. I'm sorry, because you open first. So, I can go ahead with the first closing arguments that I have here. So, I caught Jacob here in 3 different massive contradictions. Let's go through all of them. The first contradiction is that he claims that it would be a violation of the NAP, or the non-aggression principle, to stop people from doing gay marriage, for instance. Or we could just kind of broadly consider this sexual deviancy or sexual crimes against yourself, or drugs, things like this, crimes against yourself. He says we're not supposed to be able to transgress against those people, that's not good. You can't take the civil authority and have them go and correct this transgression against you. The problem with this is that when we get to animals or things like this, which would also be considered property, and I give him a scenario in which the deviancy occurs, his Christian ethics determine that he knows that this is bestiality, therefore immoral, has no real problem with the civil authority stepping in. He's not outside of any like goat humpers clinic going, oh, we got to free him from jail because the civil authority put him in jail for humping a goat, right? He doesn't give a shit. He doesn't care because he knows that the ethical standard was upheld. So when the non-aggression principle applies there, he kind of just goes, well, I guess we just let him hump goats, right? But ethically, he knows that that's also incorrect. When it comes, the next contradiction comes in when he's talking about violence itself. Because he can't give a definition of violence other than from a Christian worldview, he expects everybody else to concede to that definition. And if they don't, he's going to use violence against them. Not even kidding, not joking. So the standard for the non-aggression principle from Jacob is that you should be allowed to aggress against other people who do not hold Christian ethics as their standard, because they could be doing unethical things, which you then need to stop. But he didn't actually say why it is that they should adhere to that Christian standard, only that if they don't, he's going to do something about it, right? He will mobilize the state to stop those abortions, even if half or 30% or 20% of people don't believe that this is actually conducting violence. He will definitely conduct violence on them. And he'll do it quickly in order to enforce his standard of morality. So they have to adhere to it, but he never gave us an ought for why they should. He just kind of prattled about how different fucking philosophers talk about these different scenarios, and he's not really sure how it ties in exactly, but because he's never really thought about it before, never thought about the animals before, never thought about why it is that people should uphold his ethical standard. So now there was multiple contradictions here. I pointed them out in real time. It's very clear to me that the non-aggression principle and Christian ethics are contrary to one another, because Christian ethics would move you into dutifully utilizing force if necessary to stop these unethical things inside of society, utilizing the civil authority from your standard. The problem is not everybody upholds the same standard. And since that is true, he's just fine activating the civil authority for his own. So the non-aggression principle really kind of conflicts with his worldview here ultimately. And then lastly, we didn't really get into marriage, unfortunately. We were really bogged down on the rest of the libertarianism. I'd actually like to come back and have that debate at some point with you down the road, Jake. It won't be probably for a long while because I'm always booked up. But I also wanted to say that I appreciate him coming out for the debate. I thought it was very spirited and very cordial. There wasn't nearly as much cutting off and things like this as there could have been. But I ultimately appreciated it. And with my closing, I'll just say that I think that we're going to be able to move Jacob over to the dark side and abandon this libertarian madness that he currently finds himself in because, well, it's stupid. Ultimately, he wants the same thing that I want, which is that there's a single church body which essentially governs everything from his worldview, and that it's monolithic and has the ultimate authority when it comes to the use of force in a moral way. So I feel like this. Ultimately, here's what I think is going to happen. I hope he's going to come to the dark side. We will move him over to us with a red lightsaber. Right, Jacob? You're coming over this direction. Hopefully, we'll be glad to have you over here. With that, I'll yield my time. Thank you very much for coming out this evening.
All right. Jacob, you want to take as much time as you need of your 7 minutes for that closing statement. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, first of all, yeah, this was a lot of fun. Going back and forth like that is ideas clashing and whatnot is good, and you always learn from it, and you find areas where you're where you need to go back and cover some gaps in your worldview because you just haven't thought about everything yet. I will admit that I spent a lot more time thinking about I haven't thought about the intricacies of libertarian legal theory in the realm of goat screwing and necrophilia. Those are things that I'm happy to go back to the drawing board and look at. The things that Andrew pointed out that he's calling contradictions. I think this is just a difference in how we're describing our worldviews and somewhat semantics. And I said in our little back and forth before we started this that there's going to be some pushback and some tangling, but there's also going to be a lot of crossover. I'm a Christian first and foremost. If there's anything that I believe and it comes in conflict with my Christian principles, I'm not going to yield my Christian principles. I am a bondservant of Christ. I am a soldier for his kingdom first and foremost.
Based.
And the use of so then people might ask, Andrew would ask, well, then why are you tying yourself to libertarianism? Again, I think that there are important lessons from libertarian political theory that not only map onto Christianity, but again, like the passages that I brought up in 1 Samuel 8, there's more we could get into. We didn't get into a lot of theology, it was more philosophy, which is fine. But I think that there are, if we believe in following Christian ethics and Christian morality, and even the idea of Christian governance, which I'm not against the idea of, governance is going to exist. And insofar as governance will exist, I would prefer the governance be filled with Christians and enforcing Christian morality. It has to enforce something. It's either going to enforce Christian morality or it'll enforce some other kind of morality. And I do reject the idea that there can be just a neutral culture where it's just completely diverse and everyone's like, no, like there's going to be a dominant culture, and I do want ultimately that to be Christian. I want my worldview to win. So I'm not going to shy away from that either. But I think that insofar as I want my worldview to win, I think that there are moral imperatives, moral commands. That's where morality comes from. It comes from God and his commands. That there are commands that place obligations upon Christians. And I think one of them is that we are obligated to not commit aggression against those who have not committed aggression. And who defines aggression? I think that God defines aggression through the Bible, through his word, and even through church tradition. And so, again, we could get into that. I think that there are different Christian theologians, historians, church fathers who agreed with my view of the state, that ultimately it is a somewhat of a zero-sum game between the kingdoms of man and the kingdom of God. You cannot serve two masters. One of the horrible doctrines that came out of Protestant theology is the two kingdom theology of Luther, which I can't stand. And I think that we have to live for the kingdom of God first, and we need to be so within my Reformed circles are more of a Kuyperian. I think we need to be reclaiming culture, reclaiming institutions for Christ, but that means that we have to the current power structures that exist. We need to recognize the incentive structures of them, that they ultimately will be drawn towards. This is what what's my time, by the way? Just a minute. 3. Okay. Just to to quote Hoppe again, I recommend everyone read Hoppe, like Getting Libertarianism Right, The Democracy That God That Failed. Hoppe is one of the best libertarian thinkers who understood there needs to be a fusion, I think, between Christian conservatism and libertarianism. And Hoppe gets a lot of crap from libertarians, and I do too. So I'm not. But yeah, the idea that the incentive structure of state power is ultimately that it's going to promote that which is high time preference, because that is what, once you're in power, you are not just concerned with using that power to advance your worldview, you have to be concerned with holding on to that power. And once you have given a monopoly of force to people, that they can conscript people, that they can take property from them, that they can have a monopoly of law and initiate force against them, those those rights or powers you've given to that monopoly are going to attract others who want to use that power to then on their behalf. And this is how you get what we have today, which is we essentially have, it's not a free market society, not a free market economy. It's a indirect command economy. What we have right now is very close to fascism, in which the market, insofar as it exists, is subservient to the state. We saw this during lockdowns. Corporations were willing to kiss the ass of whatever the state bureaucrats told them to do. They couldn't do it quick enough, because once you have power, then power becomes for sale, and it goes to the highest bidder, and then it feeds into itself. And they're going to promote the high time preference behaviors, the degeneracy, because that's good for them. Because if people are distracted by numbing themselves in this very hedonistic, very self-indulgent way that our culture does, they're too distracted to notice that they've been enslaved by the state apparatus, that they essentially exist as tax cattle, as the working class to uphold this ruling class. So that is where I think libertarianism has important insights that Christians need to wrestle with. Again, I think Christians and conservatives need to learn a libertarian lesson, and I think libertarians need to learn a conservative lesson as well. So yeah, the things that I'll end on this, the things that Andrew said, these are contradictions. It's like, sure, like to some libertarians, these are contradictions. I don't really care about like being some ideologically pure libertarian as defined by like the absurdities of non-Christian libertarians. I am a Christian, and I think that libertarianism has a lot of valuable insights. And with that, I'll yield my time.
All right, appreciate it. The dark side is coming for you, by the way. We will move into the call-in section. Kyle, if you don't mind, I've got them in the background. I don't know, did we give you the permissions to pull callers in and out, or do we still need to do that? Okay, we'll get that all taken care of for you, dude. Gene, you've been waiting patiently in the background. Go ahead when you're ready.
Hello, Andrew and Jacob and Kyle. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. How you doing, Gene?
What's up, Gene?
Long time no talk.
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks.
By the way, I've been reading your great book. It's fantastic. I've got it on my nightstand right now. I got halfway through it last night, so it's a good read.
That's awesome. I'm really glad to hear that. So the question I have is going to be for Jacob. Am I allowed to like ask one question and then do a follow up?
Yeah, you can. Together? Yep.
Okay. So Jacob, do you worship You're a Christian libertarian, if I understand correctly, correct?
I'm a Christian, and I think that libertarian political philosophy is largely correct, but I mean, I don't go around saying I'm a Christian libertarian. Like I'm a Christian.
All right, well,
but yeah, I mean, you basically just to clarify that.
Okay. Well, do you worship the God of the Bible or the God of Plato?
I worship the God of the Bible.
Okay. The God of the Bible violates the non-aggression principle all the time. How exactly is it a problem if people die? Why is it a bad thing if we kill people?
Right. So you're confusing horizontal and vertical relationships. So yeah, in the vertical sense, we are subservient to God, and I think God is like the ultimate owner and decider of everything that happens. We're also sinners, and so we as Christians from the Christian worldview believe that God would be just in just wiping the slate clean at any moment and saying, you know, you all deserve hell. The wages of sin is death, and off you go. And what makes the gospel message so impactful and amazing is that despite
Jacob,
the
I don't
fact
mean
that
to,
we
I don't
were-
mean to cut in. Just remember with the callers, we want to keep the
Sure,
back and forth super concise. Okay.
Right. So, the gospel message is we got grace when we didn't deserve it, so God's allowed
Okay.
to execute judgment. But as Romans 12 says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And so there's a difference between what we're allowed to do and what God's allowed to do, because God and man are different. So you're confusing what's allowed on the horizontal plane
I
versus the
agree.
vertical.
No, I agree that God can do things that we don't have to do. God doesn't have to atone for himself, obviously. But God can give orders to people who follow his religion to kill other people. You do know that St. Paul punishes people for blasphemy, right?
I'd want to know a citation for that.
1 Timothy 1:20 and 1 Corinthians 5:13. He delivers people to Satan is the exact quote for their blasphemy. Is he not allowed to do that? Is that being too aggressive?
I'd have to look into that more. I haven't encountered those passages. I don't know what the
All
blasphemy
right, let me
was.
ask another one real quick. That's okay. You don't have to know every single verse. Let me ask another one real quick, and then I'll give a chance for other people to pop in. Do you think the morality that Jesus Christ teaches is different from the morality of the Old Testament, particularly in the covenant of Sinai, Moses?
Yeah, so I got into this a little bit in my intro, and it's hard to condense this, but I think that the Mosaic covenant was the term is an eschatological intrusion, and so I think that there were like a suspension of normal play and of natural law, which I know Andrew doesn't agree with, but
Me neither.
and that's fine. But yeah, I think that there were a different set of rules at play for the saga of ancient Israel within the Mosaic covenant.
Okay, so I'm trying to keep this snappy because Andrew said we don't want to have too many long answers. So you're basically saying that Jesus said to love our enemies, but they weren't doing that in the time of Moses, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly.
Well, so justice can sometimes be loving, and I think that part of that eschatological intrusion, and this is said in the Bible, was that he was delivering justice to the Canaanites. But he also did say that at one point, he told the Israelites, you're not going into the promised land yet because their sin has not yet, reached its fulfillment. So, within the natural grace order, God gives people and nations a chance to repent, but then he also has the prerogative to give a direct command to go execute his judgment, but he's given no such command for anybody today.
Well, I'm going to leave you two little thoughts here, and then I'll leave time for other people to pop in. Number one, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, God punishes the Canaanites for not adhering to the law of Moses, even though they never heard of it. So that's not exactly giving them a fair chance, but they still get punished for it no matter what.
I think that's proof for natural law, by the way, but...
No, that's not proof of natural law and natural theology or perennialism. There's a difference between there being the objective standard that God bears and forces into the world versus saying all religions have the same exact kind of truth. Secondly, I was just going to say that when Jesus Christ says to love your enemies, he's actually quoting the Old Testament. So if Moses and Solomon, who both say love your enemies, love their enemies, yet they still decapitate people, I think it's perfectly in line to have a militaristic arm of Christianity to enforce morality in the world. I don't see any contradiction with that in the New Testament, and I can't find any real pacifism in the New Testament either.
No, I'm not a pacifist.
James, I appreciate the call in. Have yourself a wonderful night. Again, go buy James' book. I'll put it in the link if you send it over to me, James. It's quite good. I enjoyed it. You should read it as well, Jacob. In fact, in the spirit of good sportsmanship, I'll send you a copy on me.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Andrew.
Yep. Take care, James. Sorry I had to cut you off there. Grid 1. Motorsport's been waiting patiently in the background. Go ahead when you're ready.
I have been waiting patiently. I have an echo for some reason. Is it better?
No, you're fine. There's no echo.
Oh, weird. I got an echo on my end. That's okay. I can deal with it. Jacob, I've listened to this. It's been really pretty good. And actually, a lot of what I was going to say has already actually been said by Jim. How do you reconcile that throughout the biblical sense and throughout time, the only way that we've actually been able to enforce any sort of lasting peace has been through the use of force, the threat of force, and the existence of that force? How do you resolve that with what your libertarian viewpoint is?
Yeah, again, I think that this is a confusion that some people think that libertarianism or Christian libertarianism is pacifism, that there's no, that there is a just use of force. And I tried to make this very clear in my intro. The Bible is very clear that governing authorities are established by God to enforce what is good, but I think that's limited to a civil sense. I think that because God because God is sovereign and his authority is ultimate, any authority he delegates is limited and can only be used to what is specifically prescribed.
By the way, I raised your audio up on this in grid 1 so people can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I had it turned down. Okay, well, still, you just seem to have this, like, even though you keep claiming that you're not a pacifist, you keep saying pacifist things.
Can you give me an example of a pacifist thing I've said? The pacifism would say that if someone harms you, you can't defend yourself. I'm totally for self-defense. I'm totally for the adjudication of property rights. I'm even for a just war theory. So I think
I didn't hear you say that you were for a just war theory. I mean, as a matter of fact,
I think that, so if you understand the doctrine of just war theory, it's pretty stringent. You have to exhaust all options for peace under just war theory. But yeah, if you exhaust all options for peace and you have to go to war, that's an extension of people. If individuals have a right to self-defense, then a group of individuals can also have a right to self-defense.
Okay, so
the only thing libertarianism is rejecting, and I think that is consistent with biblical principles, is that is the initiation of violence against non-violent people.
We gotta wrap the call, guys. We have nine. We have 9 people in the background. Grid, your last thoughts here, bro.
It just seems like that you are ignoring the fact that governments, and I like Andrew's philosophy of government, does need to have that force continuum regardless. And I think you ignore that and you just kind of wave it away. But maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before.
By the way, Grid 1, I would highly recommend Jacob for your channel. He does a lot of regular discussions rather than debates. I noticed on his channel, very good faith guy. I'd recommend that you have him on. Anyway, have a good night, man. You take care. Guys, I see all of you in the call queue in the back. I'm just going in the order in which it was received, except for this one, which is Chase Haggard, because Chase Haggard does control the entire ortho-bro sphere. He pulls all of the strings in the background. Nobody knows that he is the true Dark Lord, but he is. Go ahead, Chase, when you're ready.
Thank you for that, Andrew. You can have a cigarette. Jacob, I wanted to ask you. I know that Andrew went through that example about it's a landowner where water ran through, and if the landowner were to say, no, I'm just going to block all trade and water coming through to other people, you said that you would want to go and, reason with this person, right? If they had homesteaded.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to first try to, find peaceable solutions, talking things out, and then you make further escalations from there as necessary.
Cool. Okay. And you said that you're reformed, so you believe in total depravity?
Yes.
Okay. And these people could be totally depraved and theologically, because of your theology, have no ability to actually reason correctly in a godly way.
Well, the reformed view would be that although people are totally depraved, that the meaning of that is total inability means the ability to save themselves. It doesn't mean that they're evil as they could be at all possible times, and or that they can't restrain any of their sinful desires at all. That wouldn't be part of Reformed theology.
Yeah. So, but again, it's going to be that they are deficient in their ability to go and choose the good. Think about
why God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Like, because the common.
Well, that's an expression. He didn't actually. I'm Orthodox. I don't believe in secondary causation. People not being able to, choose to participate with God's will, because that would make God a monster. But my critique is that you're appealing to these people being able to reason when they could all just be totally depraved, and you could be totally depraved in thinking that libertarian theology is correct, or sorry, libertarian political theory is correct, and you could just be totally depraved.
So I'll give a quick answer here. If your view is correct, this doesn't seem to be a problem. If Reformed theology is wrong, if Reformed theology is right, then the view is that God actively restrains the evil in the hearts of man, and also that oftentimes people will act in their own rational self-interest, even if they are depraved, because they know, and this is so the Reformed apologetic on God hardening Pharaoh's heart is that he did it because he knew Pharaoh would just let the Israelites go to save himself. So
that's not answering my question.
Can you repeat the question quick?
My question was again about you appealing to people's ability to go and they would happily reason with you in this libertarian way to go and
necessarily. I'm not creating a utopian premise that like automatically everyone necessarily would. And I've also said that libertarian ideas work best in a culture that's Christian. I think that the less
Yeah, but
Christian
we
a
can't make
culture
it.
is, the more authoritarian it will be.
Yeah, but we can't even make a Christian culture because we don't have control over God's secret decree to go and subsume people with God's irresistible grace. So what's the point of even trying to make Christians?
Yeah, well, that's diving into a whole different,
Yep.
whole
Well, I
different
appreciate
line
the
of
time.
Yeah,
argumentation.
Chase,
I
we
appreciate the
gotta
time.
move on from
Have a
there.
good one.
Of course, if you want to set up a debate, Chase, you're always welcome on the Crucible as the Dark Lord of the Ortho Bros. Appreciate your call in.
Have a
very
good one,
much.
Jacob. Thank you.
Jim Bob, you've been
Hey.
waiting patiently in the background. Go ahead with your questions. Garbage, I'll get to you next, followed by Not Your Dude. Go ahead, Jim Bob.
Jacob, would you say erecting a building of any sort would be an act of aggression?
I would need more context. If I erect a building on someone else's property, that could be an act.
No,
of
on your own property.
No.
Okay, let's say your property is in the midst of a public arena. Okay.
Well, I'd say like normatively, no. I mean, again, we can like if I built a really tall building that wasn't structurally sound and then it like fell over and damaged someone else's property. Like
How about a structurally sound, perfect, highest degree carpenters and contractors and architects get together and erect a building that looks, I don't know.